Folkesson and Miriam van der Valk with their topic, What to do with difficult people, a psychologist and a philosopher put their heads together. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So this is Kajsa, who is a licensed psychologist, and my name is Miriam, and I have a philosophical practice. And we're both involved in Sweden, and we both do therapy or counseling with groups and individuals. So we've been working together for 3 years or something like that, and we like to approach important questions from the perspectives of our respective fields to sort of weave together a matrix of wisdom.
We also recently finalized our contribution to new anthology by Folkesson High School about reflective research in philosophical practice. We wrote about how we met, basically, but also the topic of my master's thesis in clinical psychology, which was experiencing authenticity as a talking professional. But more on that another time.
Yes. We also did public lectures together, and we did one on with red wine, of course, because we're philosophers. So we did one on personality typing, for example. Can you categorize people, and is it a good thing to do? What would contemporary psychology say, and what would Socrates say, kind of thing. And then we did one on conspiratorial thinking. What happens when you believe that somebody is willfully misleading you? Like Descartes' evil demon type of thing. Really fun. So these are all the things that we sort of think that you should think out loud together about more often. So that's what we want to do. Thinking out loud. It's just that the idea is to practice focused, directed thinking together, right? And to hope that we see the progress of our thought process, where we started and what happened. Like, what was your original question? What obstacles did you run into, and where are you now? Type of thing. What did you see? Did you fall? So today we want to talk about difficult people. What do you do with them? And what do I do when I notice that I'm difficult? And what does that mean? What happens when I or someone else is difficult? When things just don't go smoothly. Like when dialogue breaks down, or when there is the situation is too charged, or it feels destructive, or you can just imagine that colleague or family member or yourself. Sometimes it's harsh words, or sometimes it's being oppositional, the tug of war type of situation, or pulling away. That's another version. This is not unusual. We're talking about these very, very common situations that everyone has been.
Yeah, you know this.
Yeah, everyone knows these situations. Okay, so we have a theory about what happens when that happens. So it expresses itself differently for different people, but the way we see it is that when we suffer, like anyone, or you and I, or everyone, when we suffer, we become closed systems. And this goes for if you just smashed your toe into a chair, or you have a migraine, or you have a bout of rejection-sensitive dysphoria, or you were just so overwhelmed by shame that you close off, or guilt, unbearable guilt, something like that. When we suffer, we become a closed system. So what we mean by that is that you're closed for some real input kind of thing. Everything that happens is interpreted within a sort of private matrix of meaning. So it just looks like a distorted, everything looks like it comes from a distorted glass type thing. You're closed off like that. Yeah, so whatever happens, if somebody is trying to tell you that, give that perspective or something, you simply don't believe it, because you can only interpret within your own personal hell matrix. Yeah, nothing comes through, it's just like, this closed system where there's no permeability. Our theory is that this happens when you suffer. Suffering equals being a closed system, so that's the theory. And the task, of course, is to make sure that we have this permeability every day, that we open up for input on someone, so that we can live in the world and not just our own singular private worlds. Yeah, the shareable world, that's where we want to live. Where we can live together. It's separate individuals but under the same conditions, like we're all embodied, and we all have a psyche, and we all have language, like these difficult things that are part of the human condition. And we don't have telepathy, at least not in any sort of organized or predictable way just yet, right? So the title is What to Do with Difficult People. It's a little bit provocative, of course, but what we want to talk about is something like suffering equals being closed off to a degree and amount of time. The suffering, or this closed offness, perpetuates suffering. Again, not all suffering people are difficult, but most difficult people operate sort of within a closed system. And the task is to ensure that we have a little bit of openness around this, like a channel to the world, the place where we can live together with people. To know that the other is a person like me, right? And that's when we can be ourselves and flourish. So the maxim is, of course, to know thyself. I am a person like you. You are a person like me. When I have been in my closed off hell sort of thing, which is it's kind of like a private prison where I sort of go in and throw away the key, and there's only this tiny little vent in the upper corner of the room, and I can escape into sort of the spiritual world or something like that. But that's still not the real world, right? Philosophy is the answer, of course. It's always the answer. And that's what we hope to have shown at the end of these 20 minutes. Curiosity, wisdom seeking, logic and discernment, and then the big question, what to do now? What is right action? Now that this is the case, what do we do now? Yeah.
So, when we talk about difficult people, the psychopathological vocabulary is often very close at hand. I'm sure you've all heard something like this, like, my boss was a total narcissist, believe me. My mother-in-law is acting all BPD again, or that's just her autism showing. Quaint. This really shows how we increasingly name our demons with the help of psychiatrically defined syndromes, and how the society has increasingly come to adopt a psychopathological narrative on difficult people. However, these categorical descriptions of difficult people in terms such as narcissist, or borderline, or autistic, they tell us very little really about the underlying dynamics that fuel these conditions. So if we want to empathize, if we want to help, if we want to encourage self-discovery, a much more useful question is what vicious cycles need breaking in all of these conditions. This is where we look back to the concept of closed system, as we like to call it. I believe that we can all agree that something distinctive about difficult people is their pervasive tendency to get stuck in thesis or antithesis without the ability to compromise or synthesize. Our respective fields, psychology and philosophy, have come up with countless terms to describe this underlying dynamic, this tendency of getting stuck in polarities. For example, the Stoics and skeptics called it dogmatism. Freud called it splitting. Marcelo Trezzi, American sociologist, called it pseudo-skepticism. David Barlow, expert in cognitive behavioral therapy, called it cognitive inflexibility. And Marsha Linehan, the founder of dialectical behavioral therapy, called it dialectical collapse or dialectical failure. What does that mean? Well, that means that when we are difficult, we cannot fathom how one proposition and its total opposite can be true simultaneously. For example, that we can both love our parents and hate them for some of their life choices or their decisions in raising us, their mistakes. Or that we can both be different, individual, and simultaneously belong with others, appreciated in our individuality. The reality, of course, is that any system or entity, no matter how small, there is polarity within it, right? reality isn't static. It's not a static concept, but comprised of internal opposing forces that, when we synthesize them, once again evolve into new sets of opposing forces. When we talk about closed systems at their most severe, the part becomes the whole. The symptom, the emotion, the sensation, the thought, becomes the person. And I'm sure you've all heard people expressing themselves along these lines. Oh, I'm in control when I don't eat. I feel very proud of my discipline. Other people just don't get that feeling. I don't see why being a perfectionist is such a bad thing. Rest is for people who don't care enough about their topic. Or I don't think I'm arrogant, I just know that I'm better than most at what I do. When this happens, the person can no longer catch their difficulty, no matter if it causes significant distress or dysfunction in themselves and others. In psychiatry, what we call this state is egosyntonic attribution, directing cause in line with self. In this state, of course, we usually don't need difficult people. They don't seek help, our help, naturally. Because the way of being in the world, our way of being when we are difficult, feels natural, feels justified, might even feel like a moral obligation of being.
Right. Thanks. So, jumping now to just over a year ago, which is when I got my autism diagnosis. So I'm autistic and exceptionally gifted. And this diagnosis is one of the best things that ever happened to me, because it explains so much about my difficulties and also showed almost simultaneously a way out. Right? So there are only three things that all autistic people have in common. One is repetitive behaviors, which is usually about creating safety in a super overwhelming world, but it's also about how autistic people don't automate as much as other people do. So you might have to write instructions for how to use your coffee machine and things like that. And then it's special interests, that you get really, really into something for months or years or forever. And then difficulty with social interactions. Right? So all of these things potentially make you a bit difficult. For example, we had at the office where I used to work, we had a receptionist who sometimes said a bit funny things. So at one point she said, did you know that you become tall by playing basketball? And I was thinking in the sort of 0.02 second thought, like, how would that work? Does something sort of in your vertebrae creates more air between vertebrae when you jump, but wouldn't that contract again when you hit the floor? And so I just said, really? How would that work? And then she got upset because she thought that, you know, I should have realized that she didn't mean what she said. She was just talking, and she got it wrong, basically. And it was very rude and arrogant of me to point it out with that question. So she closed off. And I, of course, also closed off. Because I had been in that situation, you know, a million times before. So I closed off again and thinking, like, why did this happen? What's wrong with me? Why can't I just be normal? And never going to talk to anyone ever again. But I did. It is a pretty typical situation, sort of, when it doesn't work, when the situation doesn't, when we both close off. And they say that when you don't understand something, you attribute negative intent. And this can go for almost anything, like someone cutting me off in the line at the supermarket, or it raining, you know, typical, my luck, it's raining again. You attribute negative intent to the rain, or to anything. And this is sort of what it's like when we're in our hells. Yes? Yeah.
So there's something I'd like to share too, a case study. A particularly difficult therapy session that I'll just never forget. It was with an exceptionally difficult young woman in her 20s. She was stuck in the highest arrogance at one point and deepest self-loathing the other. And she'd made it her personal mission to prove her therapist wrong. So she came in with a smug smile on her face, and she sat down in her chair, and she was like, man, I've got a dream for you to analyze today. I was deep in my compulsive empiricist phase of academia at that point, and I had just entered psychodynamic therapy. As a patient, mind you, 40 hours of therapy were mandatory for earning my master's thesis of clinical psychology. I'd been so sure that day that I'd be able to expose dream analysis as quack and simultaneously get revenge on my psychodynamic therapist for all those upsetting implications he'd make about how I choose my partner. So I recount my brutal nightmare to him. I'm the 8-year-old daughter of the Queen, and we have traveled to some remote barbarian village in the outbacks, medieval style, to negotiate peace between our people. My mother, the Queen, walks up to the chief on his throne and she begs him to listen to the voice of reason. Instead of answering, the chief stands up from his throne and he unsheathes his axe and he decapitates my mother mid-sentence. And her head rolls, and her body slumps, and I scream in terror, and the barbarians drag me out to a bloody pole in their courtyard and tie me up for all to see and to be dealt with later. My therapist listens to this, concerned but not unnerved, and he says something like, well, that was certainly grotesque. This speaks of a primal wrath, even though you're not the one to decapitate your mother. I'm sure he said plenty of other wise things that session too, but that's the thing that stuck with me, because I've never told him. I've never brought it up. In fact, I don't think even my inner voice had articulated that thought until that moment. Yes, I was furious at my mother for several different reasons. For calling me several times a week to complain about her boss. For not even realizing how much it hurt me to hear this vicious cycle repeated over and over again. But most of all, for not realizing how much she'd missed about my life because of this vicious cycle. And I remember I started weeping, and I continued the session by confessing how much I loved my mother for all she'd done for me, but also how I couldn't stop thinking of the negligent things she'd done. Hate and love, thesis and antithesis, synthesized for me that day. And since then I've had a much easier time forgiving my mother in all her human fallibility.
So I came across this lovely quote by supposedly Spinoza, and he said, don't cry, don't get upset, understand. So how do you do that? How do you understand everything? When you begin with philosophy's questions, like what sort of things are there? What are feelings, for example? How do you know anything at all? How can I tell what's what? How can I reach any type of valid conclusion? And then the big question, and what do I do now? What's the right thing to do now? So to that receptionist that I talked about, my question must have sounded something like, you're an idiot, you know, in her private interpretation of things. But if we look at the situation again, you can see that, like, without getting upset or crying, trying to understand, we can see that I did not judge her at all, and I was completely serious. I took her completely seriously, and I wanted to sort of engage with her in this exploration about basketball and height and the respective causal causalities there. And we could have loved together. We could have done this together if we had remained open. So know thyself then. How do I talk? How do I sound like? But also, how do I interpret things? Like, what are my fears and my desires? What makes me interpret in the way I do? What are my traumatized core beliefs about myself and my place in the world? And how can I evolve my self-compassion too? You know, because rationality is not harsh, it's neutral. If anything, seeing clearly can give a sense of, finally straightening your back and thinking like, I can live, I can handle life. You know, rationality. Like J-P Sartre said, A lucid view of the darkest situation is already in itself an act of optimism. It implies that the situation is thinkable. Isn't that nice? The situation is thinkable. That means that it's shareable. We're not shut off in our closed private house. So the aim is to take an interest in das Ding an sich, even if it is difficult.
So we strongly believe that when we meet these closed systems, regardless of why, it is best addressed through the collaboration between our fields. As professionals, our task is threefold in these cases. Firstly, our core ambition must be to facilitate our clients' commute between opposites, between inner and outer, between suffering and bliss, between me and you, between acceptance and between change. Marshall Linnen said it best: the spirit of dialectical points of view is to never accept a final truth or an indisputable fact. Thus, the question that needs constant addressing in our healing conversations is, what is being left out of our understanding now? Secondly, we need to slow the client down with our questions so that they can take in the view as they traverse this broader range of human experience. We model comfort in constant ambiguity. We believe in wisdom within contradictions, not contradictions within wisdom. When we are philosophical and we demonstrate a philosophical way of being, we model the approach that we want our clients to experience. And lastly, we create enough safety for the client to settle in the middle, in synthesis of what once felt like incompatible truths. Put it simply, our presence and our guidance is needed most at the moment when a person dares to whisper the 5 most transformative words of self-discovery. But I could be wrong.
Seneca said, when I am capable of it, I shall live as I should. So if you can answer that to the question of sort of, if you're living the way you want, if you follow your inner compass, if you stay true to your values, your authentic self, that is sort of what we're trying to do. I'm capable of it, I should live as I should.
Yeah, because accountability of our difficulty as counselors, as therapists, as human beings, is the prerequisite, perhaps the only way that we may be enabled